I have mixed feelings when it comes to APUs, and testing the Ryzen 5 4600G only helped consolidate that. But hopefully, by the end of the following videos, I'll be able to make my point that deciding to use APUs as a stopgap solution until getting a good GPU comes with some serious compromises. Pretty much all APUs will sacrifice some CPU features in order to allow a GPU to be hosted on the same die. The 4600G, however, seems to do the least amount of compromises. While the previous APUs would have their amount of PCIe lanes available to external GPUs limited to 8, the 4600G allows 16. However, unlike the Ryzen 5 3600 that uses the same architecture and PCIe Gen 4, the 4600G is a Gen 3 CPU. The amount of L3 cache is another area where the 4600G compromises, offering only 8 MB compared to the 32 MB on the 3600. The CPU also gets, usually, some more restrictive power constraints to allow some TDP budget for the iGPU. I would expect that in CPU-bound scenarios, only the L3 cache would negatively impact performance, whereas in situations we pair it with a dedicated GPU that runs out of VRAM, it would be the slower PCIe standard that would play a part in worsening the game experience. Now, this is the theory. How much performance loss we're talking about? Well, that's what we'll find out, and in this first video we'll focus on the CPU side of things. This means testing mainly in CPU limited scenarios, think CS2 low settings. We will also run the video compression test to gauge the IPC. The expectation here is that the Ryzen 5 4600G will finish the test in about the same amount of clock cycles as the Ryzen 5 3600, maybe just a bit more due to the smaller cache. On occasion, we will also mention the results we got from testing the same games on the Ryzen 5 3600, with an overall comparison in the conclusions. The test system uses an MSI B450 Tomahawk motherboard, 32GB of DDR4 running in dual channel at 3000 MHz, and an RX 5080 pieced together from Gigabyte hardware. Everything was then thrown together in a 20 years old case adapted to house modern hardware. Unfortunately, the RX 580 is hardly a GPU that will push the bottleneck to the CPU. For Marvel Rivals, I dropped the resolution to 720 with performance upscaling and lower settings, and I'm still not confident about these results being relevant for the CPU alone. Still, at 128 FPS on average and slightly over 100 FPS for the 1% lows, the game experience is pretty good, and the Ryzen 4600G will not be a major problem here. But looking at the results for the Ryzen 5 3600, and we can see that cutting down the cache by a factor of 4 did end up harming the performance, with the 4600G lagging behind the 3600 by almost 40 FPS on average and 30 for the 1% lows. I ran the canned benchmark from Cyberpunk 2077 at 720 resolution and performance FSR. All graphical quality options were turned to their lowest in an attempt to move the bottleneck as much as possible to the CPU. The 4600G managed 105 FPS for the average and almost 80 for the 1% lows. This means that this game will run fine, as long as you have a GPU that can keep up. I will present only the 4600G results in Fortnite. The game gets frequent map updates and even changes to the performance rendering mode that I like to use. So, 157 FPS for the average and 98 FPS for the 1% lows. This sounds fine, but the 0.1% loss of 55 is a bit sus. Even so, the casual player that I am found the game experience to be fine. While running the benchmark from Rainbow Six Siege at 720 resolution and 50% render scale, the 4600G managed 240 FPS for the average and 190 FPS for the 1% lows. The game will run just fine, and like Fortnite, the data for the Ryzen 5 3600 was captured from a different benchmark, so not really comparable. However, I do have data on Apex Legends for both CPUs. At 720 resolution and low settings, the 4600G managed 206 FPS on average and 138 FPS for the 1% lows. This is pretty good, especially since the 0.1% lows are also okay at 89 FPS. But the comparison against the 3600 points out the effects of compromising the CPU to allow a GPU on the same die. The APU runs about 32 fewer FPS on average and about the same amount of FPS fewer for the 1% lows. Add to that the 0.1% lows achieved by the Ryzen 5 3600, 159 FPS, for a massive advantage over the APU. Overwatch 2 has an FPS cap of 600, and this has the effect of leveling the performance of all the CPUs that manage to hit it. Both Ryzen 5 CPUs manage to do that, but even so, the compromises made with the 4600G will make themselves felt. The APU managed 563 FPS on average, 392 for the 1% lows, and 269 for the 0.1% lows. But the fully fledged 3600 will provide 33 FPS more on the average and about 50 more for the 1% lows and 0.1% lows respectively. The difference between the two Ryzen 5s in Counter-Strike 2 is fairly small. Add to that the rather unpredictable nature of bot matches, and it became impossible to point out a clear winner out of the two. Anyway, 720 resolution and low settings have the 4600G averaging 208 FPS and managing 112 FPS for the 1% lows. This is fine. DOTA 2 stays CPU limited at low settings even at 1080 resolution. With the resolution scale pulled back to 100%, the Ryzen 5 4600G averaged 124 FPS with 1% lows of 57. The 0.1% lows, however, are a bit concerning at 17. The fully fledged 3600 points out that cache does help with games, managing 13 FPS more on average, 27 FPS more for the 1% lows, and 31 more for the 0.1% lows. I captured data only for the Ryzen 5 4600G in Robocop at 720 resolution, low settings and lowest resolution scale possible. The CPU averaged 58 FPS and got 46 FPS for the 1% lows. Fine for this game and still GPU bound, unfortunately. Much like with CS2, the finals performed more or less the same between the Ryzen 5 4600G and the 3600. At 720 resolution and low settings, the APU managed 118 FPS for the average and 86 for the 1% lows, pretty much identical to the 3600. The APU will get a slightly worse 0.1% lows though, but not by much. I tested Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 800 by 600, lowest settings. The Ryzen 5 4600G got an average of 139 FPS and the 1% lows of 82. It's going to be the GPU that should be your worry when it comes to this title. I ran the canned benchmark from Borderlands 3 at low resolution, 1280 by 720 in this case, and lowest settings. The 4600G APU averaged 97 FPS and got the 1% lows at 70. The data collected for the fully fledged 3600 is pretty much identical. Control is the last title tested, and as you could probably guess, we have data only for the 4600G. At 960 by 540 and lower settings, the 4600G managed 148 FPS for the average and 101 FPS for the 1% lows. When it comes to IPC, I use the same method as for all CPUs reviewed in 2025. Time how much it takes for the CPU to compress a video, then multiply it by the core count and average frequency. In this case, the Ryzen 5 4600G finished in 639 seconds. And with the average frequency at almost 4.3 GHz, this then gets 16,425 billion clock cycles. Now, I kind of expected the APU to do a bit worse than the uncompromising 3600, but I did not expect that kind of a gap, with the 4600G performing more like the Ryzen 5 2600. Doing a sum for average and both percentile lows, we can get an overall image of how much the Ryzen 5 4600G compromises on the CPU front to be able to get that GPU on the same die. In situations where space is a premium, this is acceptable. This is why laptops, consoles, mini PCs and handhelds love these APUs. But in an age where the GPU availability was a problem, the APU was touted as a good stopgap. I can agree with this approach if we're talking about an iGPU that has a good performance, but it may very well be that the next video will have you rethink that. As for this one, we're done. Thanks for watching, I hope you liked it.